This video will contain spoilers for all of the Xenoblade games. While I will be going through them in release order throughout this video, I will still be bringing in details from future games when I talk about older ones, so I would recommend being okay with spoilers for everything before watching on. In fiction enjoyment crowds, the word retcon is frequently viewed with a lot of contempt, because it obviously carries connotations of all of our favorite stories being brought to ruin. That doesn't mean that retconning is always a bad thing, however, and I think the Xenoblade series is an example of it being done at least passably for the most part. That being said, not everything in the series that you might think is a retcon actually is one, and I just kind of want to go through the history of retcons in Xenoblade to see what is and what isn't, and talk about a few smaller things that you may not know about. To bring you up to speed, if you don't know exactly what I'm talking about, or English is not your first language, I'm just going to read out the first definition of retcon that will show up on Google. In a film, television series, or other fictional work, a piece of new information that imposes a different interpretation on previously described events, typically used to facilitate a dramatic plot shift or account for an inconsistency. That is retcon as a noun. It comes from the words retroactive continuity and can be also used as a verb, which just means to introduce the noun form of retcon into a work of fiction. I would also like to bring up the distinction between retcon and just adding additional information to something that wasn't completely fleshed out in the past. Obviously, some of that additional information in a later installment of a fictional work could not have been originally intended when it started being made, especially for different writers working on it later on, but in my opinion at least, that doesn't count as a retcon unless it actively contradicts or changes our interpretation of things as we initially knew them. For example, most of Future Connected I would not consider retconning Xenoblade 1. Yes, it is a sequel to 1 written about a decade later, however, it's still a sequel. It doesn't change any lore or things we knew about the original game, just elaborating on the very ambiguous new world that was created at the end of it. While yes, there are plenty of NPCs in Future Connected that did not show up in the main game, you do have to remember something that is always an ongoing fact of any video game, but especially one in this series that has massive fleshed out worlds. As big as Monolith likes making the worlds in their games, in canon, they are still significantly larger than they appear there. Shulk doesn't actually know everyone in Colony 9, and Melia was not on first-name basis with everyone guarding her in the palace in Alchemoth, so people like Maxis and Galgar existing doesn't contradict anything, it's just adding additional information. These characters always existed, they just never had any reason to talk to us during the original game. Obviously, all of the Fog King stuff exists, and that happens too, and you could argue that it's a retcon and an example of all life not walking together hand in hand, but we'll talk more about that in the Xenoblade 3 retconning previous games section, or more specifically the Future Redeemed one actually, because this stuff is all set up for 3, so I think it would make more sense to talk about that when I talk about the 3 stuff. There is one category about Future Connected, though, that I think is very interesting to talk about, and that is confirming that pieces of side content from the original game were, in fact, canon. And that's because Tyrea and Teelan are clearly both in states after completing their side quests from the main game, which means that, yeah, the party did canonically do those at some point during the main game's time. And then also Banna can show up, and since you have the option to do a Banna quest chain in Future Connected, that follows from the Banna quest chain in the base game. That probably means the party canonically did the Banna quest chain in the base game during that as well. But again, this isn't really a retcon. This optional content in the main game always existed, and the lore from optional content is true regardless of whether or not you do that optional content and learn said lore. So, while yeah, the time frames and things you need to do for some of the side content does kind of contradict what characters' motivations and positionings would be during the main story, I don't think any of those quests specifically do that, so this is just kind of a complete pass. As for the base game of Xenoblade 1, it's the first installment in an ongoing series that was originally not intended to be part of an ongoing series. You literally can't introduce retcons in there. The funny thing about that is, if Xenoblade 1 was in a different medium than the one it actually is in, then maybe some of the things in it would be retcons. Like, obviously, video games can have story updates over time, and not all of that will be written at once or have its plot fully decided. I play Final Fantasy XIV, that is very apparent in a lot of instances there. But, as a more extreme example, say Xenoblade 1 was actually a shonen manga, like many of the ones that inspired it. If that were the case, when the first chapter released, the entire plot outline probably wouldn't have been finalized at that time, so some later game plot twists, like Dixon being evil or Shulk having Zanza in him the entire time, might have ended up being retcons, just because the entire endgame hadn't been planned out when Shulk first picked up the Monado. Or, actually, I don't know, if this was a shonen manga, the first chapter would probably be mostly Dunban and you just see Shulk in one panel at the end. I don't know if Jump would let them get away with that, but we're getting way into the reeds on this one. You'd think it would be time to move on to Xenoblade X right now, because that came out between 1 and 2, or even 2 itself, because trust me, 2 retcons won a whole lot! But no, it's actually time for the elusive category of things you thought were retcons that actually aren't, because they were described in official media before Xenoblade X released. I'm basically counting this in eras. While we don't know exactly when certain writing decisions were made, if some information came out in between Xenoblade 1 and Xenoblade X, that counts as Xenoblade 1 stuff, even if it didn't make it into the game itself. And there's a lot of that, both in the Xenoblade 1 Monado secret files, and in one other thing. It's kind of unfortunate. Every Xeno game has some piece of very important material that explains a lot of details about behind-the-scenes stuff in lore that just has never been officially translated anywhere outside of Japanese. Xenogears, we all know about Perfect Works. In the Xenosaga 3 Guidebook, there's a small Q&A section. Xenoblade 1 obviously has the Monado secret file, while that did get translated into French. The English translation is a fan-made one. Xenoblade 2 has the Siren Model Kit, and I'm assuming at time of recording that some piece of the soundtrack stuff, be it the Trinity box or the special edition of the Xenoblade 3 one, will have Takahashi dropping some massive bombs as well. But there's actually another one for Xenoblade 1. Similar to the small Perfect Guide that was included in the Xenosaga 3 Japanese guidebook, there were actually small bits of lore in the Xenoblade 1 Japanese player guide. And these are bits that didn't even make it into the Monado secret file, the actual lore book for the game. I do actually have a Google Doc that translates some passages from that guidebook. Now, I am going to admit, I have no idea where this is actually from. Xenobits found this one and showed it to a few people, and I think I'm the first one who decided to make any of it into a video. But I do know as a fact that these passages are authentically from the book, and these fan translations do match up with what a machine translation just putting Google Lens over these passages seems to suggest, so I'm pretty sure these are all accurate. I will obviously leave a link to the document in the description, and maybe at some point, if we can get our hands on full scans of it, maybe like some people from the team that did the Secret Files translation or someone else would be able to actively go through and get through all of the information, because who knows, there might be even more stuff that turns out to not be retcons that we just had no way of knowing. While it's mentioned in the Secret Files and not the Player's Guide, I do want to again bring up the fact that the term that was translated into the English version as phase transition experiment and stuff related to Klaus's experiment does use identical terminology in Japanese to things from Xenosaga, so yes, while Xenoblade 2 does absolutely retcon in a ton more things that are similar to Xenosaga into the series lore, the idea of making references to it in the first place did originate from Xenoblade 1. I'd highly recommend reading through the Player's Guide fan translation on your own after this video, by the way. I'm only talking about retcon-adjacent passages. There are a few really interesting ones, like how X's concept of characters having 2 weapons was actually a planned idea for 1. There's cool stuff in there, you should look at it. First passage relevant to this video, though, is a short one about Ricky's family, where it suggests that while he and Oka are living with 11 children in Frontier Village when we meet them, there may have been older children that already left the house and became independent. So he may have more children than the implied 11, plus additional one from the ending who may or may not be Shulk, plus maybe Kino, depending on things. We don't know if the extra person in the ending is Kino, Shulk, or another biological kid, but either way, while I'm personally on Team Riku is Kino's son, the timeline would actually match up a little bit better if he's still Ricky's grandson and not son, but his parent was already older and had left the house by the time Shulk meets Ricky. The next passage is kind of a big one, though. You know how I always have been theorizing that the world of Xenoblade 1 was a pocket dimension? And I sort of was confirmed correct-ish by Xenoblade 3? Well, it turns out I just have been right the entire time, and never knew that not only was this just kind of implicit in 2 and 3, but it was also just a canon thing since Xenoblade 1. I'm going to read the entire translation of this passage. Page 275-1 translation. A sealed world. The world of Shulk & Co. is not a planet like our world. It is a sealed space containing only the Bionis, the Mechanis, and an endless ocean. Ether flowing out of the Mechanis causes the density of the ocean to be disordered, making it impossible for life to traverse it. So yeah, well, both in-universe and out-of-universe, it was pretty clear that the two titans in the oceans were the only things in the world of Xenoblade 1. The fact that it's referred to as specifically a sealed space makes the idea that it is a pocket dimension centered around where Earth used to be, and then when Shulk recreated it, he just recreated a planet in the pocket dimension where Earth used to be that maybe you could see Earth's sky from. A whole lot more sense. At least on the Xenoblade 1 side, the pocket dimension thing is true, but I don't think this exactly paints me in a particularly good light, because this has apparently been explicit fact since Xenoblade 1, and 2 had been out for at least a year before I started saying that, so, like, that's at least 5 years since I played Xenoblade 1, and like 8 since it first came out, for me to figure it out. That's not really a time frame that you should be impressed by. Skipping over plenty of very interesting passages, we get to a Q&A about more spoilery topics, and the first question actually introduces a retcon that I'm pretty sure people thought wasn't a retcon, but apparently was. Because the first question is Meyneth the researcher who tried to stop Klaus's experiment, that being the silver-haired woman who would later be named Galea in Xenoblade 2? Tetsuya Takahashi, executive director's answer is, it's not set in stone, but she was at least one of the researchers, referencing all of the people that are around in the room Klaus is in the space station in the Xenoblade 1 version of that scene. So, apparently Meyneth being Galea was a retcon. There are many things about that scene that were retconned, but I don't think anyone actually thought that part was one of them. The second to last question is the important one, though. If we made a timeline following the world's destruction and recreation, would it look something like this? Klaus's world, phase transition experiment on Earth, birth of a sealed world, Klaus becomes a god, Zanza, and controls the Monado, or Fate. Shulk opens the sealed world using the Monado 3. And the answer is, that's right. It should be noted that other worlds do exist in the sealed universe, but Shulk & Co. cannot perceive them. These worlds are free to be explored in the new universe, teeming with diverse life and new possibilities. So, the multiverse was not a retcon. There were multiple pocket dimensions next to, but separate from, the Xenoblade 1 world the entire time. Now, this answer might have been fully retconned at this point because it does mention Shulk's new world not being sealed. However, if we interpret the question fully, it's Shulk opens the sealed world using the Monado 3. That just means the pocket dimension can be gotten into. It does not necessarily mean that he left it and brought everyone back out into the regular universe. So that actually opens up things like the Fog King and the intersection and stuff happening. So that's all neat. But the idea that there are more sealed worlds in the same weird cordoned off pocket dimension is really weird. Also the fact that when Takahashi talks about the new world being filled with life, he's actually referring to other sealed worlds and not necessarily other planets in the wide universe. Again, a hint that the wider universe outside of Earth just kept on going no matter what was going on in the Xenoblade 1 world. And the coolest thing about this is, if we look at the opening cutscene of Xenoblade 3, when it shows the depiction of the Xenoblade 1 and 2 worlds coming together, we can see some more of these other pocket dimensions. Now, because of the weird metaphysics of all involved, there are actually at least 3, possibly 4, different visual depictions of the intersection. First, we have young Noah seeing the other world in the sky. Then we have this one that I'm going to talk about. Then there's the weird bubbly plane things converging together, and the bubbles of galaxies from the Nia explanation of the worlds. And then there's also the end of Future Redeemed with the outside view of the two Earths overlapping, which can probably be considered the same thing as the Earth appearing in the sky. However, in this specific depiction, the worlds are represented by balls of light. Xenoblade 1 world is presumably represented by the Kavesi blue ball, and Xenoblade 2 by the Agnian yellow one. However, those are not the only ones we can see. Not only are there some weird spheres that have a blade shield looking hexagonal thing around them and appear also to be tinted those same colors, but in the lower left hand corner, we can see a small Agnian yellow ball. And in the upper right hand corner, we can see another blue Kavesi ball that's about the same size as that one, and an even smaller Agnian yellow ball. So to me, it looks like, in addition to the Xenoblade 1 and 2 worlds coming together, we can see depictions of at least 3, possibly 5 more small universes that were created in the pocket dimensions by Klaus's experiment. The really funny thing about this is, and I fully acknowledge that I'm extrapolating things way too far, we actually would know how games set in those worlds would play because they're colored the same as the Xenoblade 2 and 1 worlds, and we know how the combat styles differ between them because of how 3 plays. So, as far as I'm concerned, because Xenoblade X's battle system is a modified version of 1's, that other Kavesi blue one we see is Mira. Nothing in canon contradicts that, so I'm going to choose to believe that. That also means there's at least 2 other universes that play like Xenoblade 2 that we'll never get to see, probably, because Xenoblade 4 is probably going to focus around the ramifications of the end of 3 and Future Redeemed, but it's cool. Klaus's thing of infinite worlds existing side by side, while he was probably talking about more of a larger scale multiverse and something, the idea that the experiment itself created multiple pocket universes was always true, and that's absolutely nuts. Anyway, now I think we can finally start talking about X. Believe it or not, I do have a few things to say about it, but it's not going to be a lot because it's outside the trilogy, so it can't really retcon things. But I'm going to talk about some more meta things related to X, and that is the plethora of Xenoblade 1 references in it. From things like the giant Oblivia ring to Telethia the Endbringer, and especially all of the things Tatsu says, people were fairly reasonably led to believe that Mira is somehow a far, far future version of the world Shulk creates at the end of Xenoblade 1. Without getting into a whole big discussion about this again, that much is deconfirmed by the ending of Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed. However, Xenoblade 3 follows from Xenoblade 2. Xenoblade 2 was released after X and retcons 1 a whole lot. So, I do not necessarily believe that said initial theorized connection to 1 was never the intent. It may very well be that Mira was initially conceptualized as a far future version of the planet Shulk created, still existing in its own little pocket dimension, but now accessible from people from the outside universe. And that when they decided to take the series in a different direction by making Xenoblade 2, they stopped that from being the case. At the very least, a story similar to that of Xenoblade 1 exists as a myth in the folklore of Nopon culture on Mira, and it could very well have been intended for that to have been the original story of Xenoblade 1, with people like the Homs and Hyentia and Machina eventually somehow fading out of existence and going extinct while Nopon stayed, and maybe some of them evolved into Elves people who also went extinct, but don't really know about that. There are a few issues with that, namely that Telethia the Endbringer was not native to Mira, which it would be if Mira was Shulk's world, and Lyn still having the Monado hairpins, but ignoring a lot of that stuff, X being a sequel in the distant future to just Xenoblade 1, which was the only other Xenoblade game when it was first released in 2015, does actually make sense on paper. Then they decided to make more Xenoblade 1 sequels, and that stopped making as much sense, so X having that specific connection to the numbered games may very well have been retconned out. That being said, I'm pretty sure that Future Connected retconned in a new connection between X and the numbered games, that being the Telethia going through the rift at the end becoming Telethia the Endbringer somehow. And as I said, it is still very possible that what turned into Mira was in some way initially created by Klaus's experiment. I was joking when I said that that blue orb in the Xenoblade 3 opening cutscene was Mira, but Mira could very well be another one of those sealed worlds that somehow became accessible by the outside world, and was accessed by people from a different, much more messed up universe than the one where Klaus's Earth came from. There's also the fact that Napon exists on Mira, and as far as we know, the only worlds where Napon are known to exist are sealed worlds created by Klaus's experiment, so that could be another connection, even if it's not the initial one that was intended by writers, or the initial one that fans had come to. And lo, do we arrive at the Xenoblade 2 retcon section, and most of these are pretty blatantly obvious, so I don't really know how much time I need to dwell on this. Basically, every piece of story and lore information connecting Xenoblade 2 to Xenoblade 1 is a retcon in some way. Alvis being Ontos, yes, was always the case before Future Redeemed. As soon as 2 came out, Alvis was Ontos, but there being a Trinity processor to begin with, and Alvis having siblings, all retcons. The Conduit, most of the Xenosaga references surrounding Klaus's world in the experiment, retcons. The first low orbit station being on a space elevator and not an orbiting space station, retcon. Klaus having a second half who's still alive and went through character development to become much less of a bad guy than Zenza, retcon. Basically, the only things in there that aren't actually retcons are the things I went out of my way earlier in the video to say weren't. That being some of the Xenosaga references, or the purpose of the experiment being doing things that happen in Xenosaga, and the fact that there were other pocket dimensions created by the experiment. Everything else was introduced in Xenoblade 2, is unique to Xenoblade 2, and contradicts what we thought happened in Xenoblade 1. The fact that there are 2 different iterations of the Birth of a Universe cutscene are enough proof that plenty of retcons were done here. Now, obviously, the actual story of Xenoblade 1 itself is not changed by any of this stuff, it's just the lore, but it does change pre-established lore to add in more Xeno elements and things from 2, so that definitely does still count as a retcon, and a lot of people think that it is a good one. Like, if you're tolerant of me enough to get this far into a Luxon video, you probably at least like Xenoblade 2, so you're probably on board with this retcon and think it's a net positive change, and I personally do. Xenoblade 1, not having a lot of Xeno elements, is great for someone getting into the Xeno series, but the fact that when it started out as kind of being the most unique child and not really having a lot of things tying it together to overarching Xeno things, being dragged into that gives it a lot more importance, I think, and yeah, it revolutionized Xeno and made X2 and 3 able to exist, but it deserves to be elevated to the same tier as them, and this retcon, putting the Zohar in an important place in its backstory, does a lot of work to do that. One part of this big retcon that I don't think I've seen anyone really talk about before is the actual time frame of all of this stuff. In Xenoblade 1, it was already confirmed that Klaus's world was in fact Earth. Space memory is based on Klaus's memory, and you could see the planets of the solar system. Clearly Klaus was from Earth. However, we weren't given a time frame for when Earth was destroyed. All we see is Klaus on a space station orbiting Earth, at some point, presumably in the future, because we don't have a space station like that already. Then, Xenoblade 2 happens, the Siren model kit confirms that the Conduit is discovered similar to how the Zohar in Xenosaga was, and we see that the Birth of a Universe cutscene takes place in the year 20XX, and that all of that accelerated technology happened because the Conduit was found. Initially, I think most people playing Xenoblade 1 would just assume, okay, Klaus comes from a far future Earth when technology has drastically advanced, whereas post-retcon, it's now the fact that only a few decades from present day have passed, but because humanity discovered an immensely powerful relic, they were able to jumpstart technology and get to that point exponentially faster. Also, building a space elevator like the Xenoblade 2 version of the cutscene depicts is actually harder to do than the orbiting space station that the Xenoblade 1 version of the scene depicts, so arguably technology was retconned to be even better in Klaus's world before it was destroyed. And also, just as a slight tangent, Yes, the fact that there are 2 Birth of a Universe cutscenes means that Xenoblade 2 retcons Xenoblade 1. But the fact there is a legitimate explanation for why the one Alvis showed Shulk is different from the one we see in Xenoblade 2 is kind of great. First off, the context between the two is different. In Xenoblade 1, Alvis is showing the scene to Shulk so he can learn about the world before. In Xenoblade 2, it's Klaus flashing back. Now you would think the computer would show a more accurate depiction of scenes, but you have to keep in mind, Shulk is kinda dumb. Like, he did not recognize Earth as a planet. He thought it was some ball of water. So, I'm kind of the opinion that Alvis slightly dumbed down the scene so Shulk would only get the pieces of information that, first off, he could comprehend easily, and second off, would be relevant for him making his decision on what to do with the universe now that he became a god. The Xenoblade 2 version of the scene only exists for the purpose of the player. And because the player lives on present-day Earth, they're a bit more likely to understand all of the stuff going on. Again, this doesn't stop the Xenoblade 2 version of the scene from majorly retconning Xenoblade 1, but it does at least offer a slight bit of explanation why they're so drastically different. As for the dialogue being different, I don't really know why Alvis wouldn't have shown Shulk the entirety of it. Like, obviously, the conduit didn't exist in the writers' minds at the time, so they couldn't include that stuff, but I don't know. Maybe the actual dialogue was some sort of combination between the two scenes, and Klaus just, because of his regret, rewrote the scene in his head a little bit, so the version he remembers has him acting a little bit differently, either better or worse than the Xenoblade 1 version, depending on your opinions, but I don't know. That's the biggest retcon in the series. You probably all already knew about that. Don't really need to say more. Next up is Torna, and that has 0 retcons in it. It's another Xenoblade 1 situation, but for another reason. Torna was originally conceptualized as part of Xenoblade 2's main story and got spun off into DLC later on during development. That means it was written at the same time as the main story of Xenoblade 2, so any additional information in it is not retconning Xenoblade 2, it is all canon stuff for Xenoblade 2 that they didn't have the space to explain during the main game. So that's pretty neat. Also, since nothing in Torna actually touches on the connections between 1 and 2, it doesn't retcon 1 either. I talked about Future Connected earlier when I talked about 1, but since it came out after Torna, I'm just gonna say this here. It is probably the last Xeno game for the foreseeable future that's not going to include some piece of retcon, unless a Xenoblade X remaster releases that includes absolutely 0 additional or changed story content, which I would not like, not because of the lack of changes, but because of the lack of additional content. I wouldn't want to wait this long for an X remaster only for it to literally be a Wii U port. We got new stuff in Future Connected when they ported Xenoblade 1. Hopefully they do something similar for X when they do get around to that. Anyway, Xenoblade 3 time. I'm going to discuss it and Future Redeemed separately, even though, based on the city statues, it seems like Future Redeemed was at least mostly outlined by the time Xenoblade 3 was finalized, just because the stuff they discuss is different, so I think it's more worth talking about them in separate chunks, even though they were conceptualized at the same time. Obviously, this means Future Redeemed doesn't retcon the base game, but the two of them retcon the previous games in the series in different ways. The first non-retcon I need to talk about is just the idea that it is a sequel to both Xenoblade 1 and 2. We obviously already knew that both games were in the same multiverse from Xenoblade 2, that being something retconning 1. However, the fact that bad things happened to the two worlds after the endings we saw isn't inherently a retcon. That would make the existence of any sequel that's not directly set up in a preceding work in a series a retcon, and I think that would be not a very useful way to discuss the concept. One thing about that I would consider one, though, is the whole Annihilation event thing. That very much seems like a way to draw up conflict for your new sequel that is crossing over both Xenoblade 1 and 2. Both Klaus's and the Xenoblade 1 player guide explanations of the multiverse don't really indicate that anything like that exists, and while this could fall under the umbrella of elaborating on a concept that wasn't very fleshed out before, but I don't think that really works in this specific case. Both Klaus and the Xenoblade 1 guidebook explanations of the multiverse don't contradict each other at all, and they also don't give any indication that there'd be anything fundamentally different in all of the different worlds in the multiverse. Especially the Xenoblade 1 Guidebook, where it says that other sealed worlds exist, implying that many of the other worlds created by the experiment were similar in nature to the one of Xenoblade 1, and of course, the world of 2 is the exact opposite of that. Even in 2, when Klaus says half of his body was sucked away into a different dimension, he doesn't really indicate that there's anything different about that dimension from a metaphysical level. It's just a different place that exists somewhere else that you can't get to using normal 3-dimensional travel. The world's using light to communicate, while I personally think it's nonsensical, is at most a subheader under this retcon and not its own thing, because some method of communication when you can't travel between the worlds physically was a necessary thing the writers needed to include for any of the plot they wanted to do to make sense. What I do think is the other major retcon in Base 3, though, is Origin. Or at least some certain aspects of it. I've gone on record before to say that, as long as you accept the idea that there are some very lightly explored concepts in Xenoblade that work virtually identically to the way they do in Gears and or Saga, Origin itself existing is the only bit of suspension of disbelief you need to understand how Xenoblade 3 happened after 1 and 2. I can accept the Souls thing, I can accept Ionios being a sort of pseudo-cognitive world, I can accept the cradles and regeneration and all of that stuff no problem, because a lot of that you can just get from core crystals or things from Xenogears and Xenosaga. But it's the construction of Origin itself that I don't think is adequately explained and would need a retcon in order to make complete sense to me. Future Redeemed's detail that Origin was built around the structure of the Ontos core is a really good one, because that eliminates the idea of Shulk and Torna and friends having to make a massive leap in technological understanding if they had something to copy off of. The problem with that, though, is the lack of conduit. I have no idea how they were able to basically make a Trinity processor emulator without access to the conduit, or how Origin was able to be powered if it was based on the Trinity processor without the conduit, unless Matthew's Numa core and N's implied Logos core were physically in there powering it in some way, which again, they still should be weaker without the conduit. Like, the power of Origin does not make sense for not having connection to something like the Zohar. So unless they were able to make the Xenoblade equivalent of Saga Zohar emulators without having the original to base that construction off of, there's going to need to be a new piece of fundamental information about how those universes work that will probably be a major retcon in order to properly explain that in my eyes. The other Origin-related thing is to do with Origin Metal itself, because this appears to be a new miracle material that we heard nothing of the likes of in either Xenoblade 1 or 2. In fact, from all we can tell, it appears to be superior to any of the materials on Klaus's world. It also appears to be better than Mechon armor, because as far as we can tell, Kavesi Faranuses are made of the stuff, and 4 weapons that appear to have Origin Metal in them, Shulk, Rex, Matthew, and Noah's Lucky 7, are capable of destroying that, and Flame Clocks. Now, A uses the Monado, so that doesn't count because obviously the Monado was already able to do this, but in Xenoblade 1, anti-Mechon weapons were made out of the same technology as the Mechon armor, and it was like a diamond scratching diamond situation. But in this case, Origin Metal appears to be just a better thing than that, which doesn't really track with the fact that, as far as I can tell, Mechon armor was made out of the same stuff as the skin of the Mechonis, and we never really saw any sort of super special material in Xenoblade 2 at all, so they must have been able to figure out something, again, without access to the conduit, that nobody else in their worlds were able to do. So, I don't know. At best, maybe they were able to hook up whatever Trinity cores they had access to and run some sort of simulation, but I feel like you'd need to retcon either the seeds of whatever Origin Metal is in, because it's also special in that it can store souls. Like, the core crystals in Origin aren't the only things that do that. The metal does it as well, so I don't know. I feel like the invention of that will require retcons in order to properly explain too. One thing that I would argue is not a retcon in Base 3 is the Rex family photo, and that's just because I personally think there are enough hints where you could draw that conclusion to his relationships with the other characters from without having to see that as knowing what the endpoint is. I know people who had guessed that for years before Xenoblade 3 came out, so I'm perfectly okay with them saying that, yes, this might not have been the exact idea that we were going to go with if we made a sequel, but we had a little hints that Nia might also be interested in Pyra and Mythra. We had the New Game Plus title screens. We had Rex understanding what she meant in the Spirit Crucible and wanting to talk to her about it later. There's enough breadcrumbs there where that is a reasonable conclusion you could draw from Xenoblade 2, so that much isn't a retcon and doesn't really change anything about those characters or their personalities or how I think they would act based on their previous portrayals. Moving on to Future Redeemed though, we do have a few more definite retcons, and I'd like to reiterate here, me pointing out something is a retcon isn't saying it's a bad thing. Like, I love Xenoblade 2, especially in how it connects to 1, which wouldn't be possible without massive retcons, and a lot of the cool bits of Future Redeemed are retcons as well. As an example, I love the detail about the Ontos processor being used as a reference for Origin. That explains something that didn't make a lot of sense in the main game. However, the Ontos processor being there in the first place is a retcon. Obviously, Alvis being Ontos to begin with and having that processor is a retcon, but in addition to Xenoblade 2, the idea that the core is still on Shulk's world is a little confusing, because I think literally everyone before playing Future Redeemed thought that Alvis had went out into space to go look at the new life that Shulk had made, or at the very least went into a different universe or something. As far as we can tell now, after that last scene, Alvis as we knew him just ceased to exist or went dormant in the core until Shulk found it, and then Alpha came into existence because of Mobius and Klaus's lingering stuff. Like, obviously A still exists and is effectively the Alvis we all know and love from Xenoblade 1 in a different body, but this still technically changes the fate of a character that we thought we at least reasonably knew before the time frame of Future Redeemed's story itself. So I think that counts as retconning the ending cutscenes of Xenoblade 1 again, instead of something new happening to a character in a sequel because that's how sequels work. Speaking of Alvis retcons, we need to talk about A's gender, and not in the way you would probably think. It's become more common knowledge since A was revealed as a character and we started to learn how A worked and presented themselves, but Alvis was never explicitly stated to be male. The Xenoblade 1 secret file lists Alvis' gender as male, ? And with just the context of 1, this makes a whole lot of sense. There's no real need to give the concept of a gender identity to an AI that had the role Alvis did. The character was always intended to be a genderless computer program presenting as a male Homs for the purpose of getting the whole Hyantia thing working properly. So nothing about this is actually retcon, right? Well, yes and no, because Ontos, Alvis, A, whatever you want to refer to the character as, that character's gender has not been retconned. The reasoning behind that character's gender has, though. Initially, it was just because there's no reason to give the lone administrative computer of a phase transition facility a gender as an AI. As of Future Redeemed, though, Ontos was but one of 3 cores in the Trinity processor, and was designed to be the deliberator or mediator between Numa, who was designed to be female, and Logos, who was designed to be male. So, kind of the reasoning did a whole 180, even if the end result is still exactly the same as it's always been. 2 interesting asides about that. Initially, I would have thought that, oh, if back in the Torna times, if Amalthus had chosen to awaken the other Aegis core, the entire game would have played out the exact same way it did. It's just that the color schemes of Malos and Mythra would be swapped because Mythra would be Logos and Malos would be Numa, but no. Numa is always female and Logos is always male, which means that the blades Amalthus and Adam would have awoken if they swapped cores would have been completely fundamentally different because they would be the opposite genders from what the canon versions of them are. So, interesting food for thought. People have been doing Aegis swap AUs literally since the game came out, but there you go, now there's a bit more information about it. And then the second one is just an interesting observation I had about pronoun use for all of the Ontos core havers that is probably only a consideration in localized versions of the game just because of how Japanese works. As far as I can tell, it seems that the rule is, if you're using the body of the Hyantia Seer Alvis, you inherit the he-him pronouns. While in present tense, Shulk doesn't use pronouns for A like everyone else in the game, in past tense he does refer to Alvis as male, which does make sense because that's how he was first introduced to him as. At this point, he sort of knows that Alvis was effectively a persona and not the true Ontos, and it does seem like it takes a little bit for him to accept that A is the Alvis he knows, so he might have initially started referring to them as two different people. What's more interesting about that, though, is everyone in the game referring to Alpha as male. Rex doing it in the opening cutscene could just be a case of, oh, at this point in time, Shulk and Rex still think it is literally the Alvis from Xenoblade 1 doing something bad, so they would treat it as if it was Alvis. But in non-flashback scenes, literally everyone refers to Alpha as male, including, I think, A at least once, which is interesting if only because A is quite literally the human parts of Ontos. Now, like, obviously, there are humans that are neither male nor female, and there are real people who do not use personal pronouns in English. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is, why doesn't Alpha, the one who is literally a heartless machine, get referred to more inanimately, I guess, is the best word for it. And the only explanations I can really have for it are, okay, we're just associating Alpha with Alvis because that's the body he's using, and we have the good parts in A already, so it's just easier to distinguish between them, or it's just a case of Klaus's lingering influence, because that's kind of the whole thing about Alpha. He's like a corrupted version of Klaus's ideals for the future filtered through the lens of Mobius, so I guess it would make sense for the being created by that alongside the Ontos core crystal and origin to also be a guy. This is just some musings. This has nothing to do with retcons, and none of what I said is explicitly canon. I just couldn't think of a better video to place this here, and I wasn't about to make just a 2-minute one because I couldn't squish that all into a short. You can't accuse me of using this to pad out the runtime. This is a me video. It was going to be long no matter what I talked about. While we're here talking about bearers of the Ontos core, I think it's time to mention the thing I said way earlier, where they did retcon Alvis's final words from the end of Xenoblade 1. Once again, though, this is probably not the retcon you're thinking they did. Those words have not been struck from canon. It didn't turn out that Alvis was lying the entire time. It's just, we didn't know what he was actually referring to. Initially, everyone was like, ah, this is clearly meaning the new world Shulk makes at the end of Xenoblade 1. All life in that world will walk together towards the future hand in hand. And then we played Xenoblade 2 and we're like, okay, maybe those two worlds can come back together in some way. And that's what Alvis was talking about. It's life from both of those worlds. And then Xenoblade 3 happened where those two worlds were literally in conflict with each other. And we're like, okay, did Alvis just lie at this point? What's going on here? Well, the ending of Future Redeemed appears to have answered that, because Shulk is like, hey, A, you kind of saw all of this coming, didn't you? And A's like, maybe. It was another timing-based retcon. All life will walk towards the future hand in hand. That life does include the life of the Xenoblade 1 and 2 worlds. But Alvis, when seeing the future and saying that, was referring to the future a couple decades past what Shulk was actually experiencing. Turns out it wasn't directly after Xenoblade 1 when Shulk recreated the world. It was 25 to 30 years later after Ionios happened and the Xenoblade 2 and 1 worlds interlinked. So, yeah. Definitely a retcon. Less of one than you would think. With that being said though, I hope you are ready for this video to very rapidly turn into something resembling the last two videos I've put out, because we have to talk about the radio again. This is the scene that keeps on giving. Did you know that people recently discovered that the numbers on the radio correspond to the Japanese release years of every mainline Xeno game from Gears through Xenoblade 3 base, and the position of the needle is slightly before halfway between 98 and 02, Gears and Saga 1, suggesting that it's representing October 99 when Monolith Soft was founded? That's an amazing Easter egg, not a retcon. What might be, though, is everything else in that scene. At this point, you probably know that that part of Future Redeemed references all of the Xeno games outside of the Klaus trilogy of Xenoblade. This was such a big deal that apparently the community decided to not bother using a spoiler warning for that even, like, the week the game came out, which is a terrible idea in my opinion. But yeah, that's stuff that exists. And this is Schrodinger's retcon. Because until either the next Xeno game or something in the future that follows up on this radio scene comes out, whether or not these things are retcons depends on whether or not you believe they are canon or not. And that is extremely funny. Like, if you think the references to X, Gears, and Saga are all just references and Easter eggs and not canon information, that's not a retcon. That's just expanding the world building of Klaus's world and doesn't affect anything about the Blade games at all. It might play into things in the future, but that would fall under the sequel category, as it's fleshing out the backstory of something that hadn't previously been explored, and if it becomes relevant later, it's the opposite of a retcon because stuff in Xenoblade 5 had actually been set up in the DLC of 3. However, if you believe any of these to be canon and go beyond mere references, then that is a retcon, because Gears and Saga were obviously never intended to be tied into Blade this way when they were first written, before Blade came out. If X was originally intended to be tied into Blade, the nature of that connection has definitely changed over the years, and the earliest they could have considered this stuff was maybe connecting Saga in base Xenoblade 2, but I don't think that's the case based on how Cosmos was portrayed. Maybe they decided to change up the X connections to how they may currently be in future connected with the Telethia thing, but Gears and Saga, if those connections are canon, those were only decided upon when they were making base 3 with the knowledge that they would do future redeemed. So, if any of this is canon, that's absolutely a massive retcon, but I don't think it would be the kind of one that people would complain about a whole lot, except for maybe disgruntled Gears and Saga fans who don't like Blade and wouldn't want it to be connected to the old games that they love so much. But that's all I've got for now. I can talk for a very long time, as you may be aware, and I think I'm going to stop talking until the next video. So until then, this is Luxon, signing off.